welcome to Making Waves, the podcast where we spotlight real projects at Kleinschmidt and the people who bring them to life. I'm your host, Ben Carey, and in each episode, we go behind the scenes of a real project, the challenges, the innovations, and the human stories that bring them to life. Today's guest is Shana Wiseman, a senior regulatory advisor at Kleinschmidt, and we'll be talking about the Bear River Narrows project, which is a really, really interesting relicensing project that Shana's worked on. And I think it is a really cool story of not only the technical and stakeholder engagement that's required with a regulatory project, but also is a good example of how sometimes these projects don't go the way that we think they will or that we intend them to go, but there's still a lot of value to be learned from discussing the project and the outcomes from it. So let's dive in and make some waves. Welcome, Shana. To start us off, I have to ask you if you've ever been on a podcast before.
I have not, but low key, not to toot my horn, I've been on NPR
Whoa.
accidentally.
So you buried the lead there. That was nice because I'm sure this interview will not be as professionally held as everything that NPR does. What was the topic on NPR, out of curiosity?
Well, uh, that's where it gets kind of interesting. I went to a wreath making class here in Washington, D.C. with a bunch of my girlfriends, and an NPR producer happened to be at that event. So,
Whoa.
you go, you have wine, they teach you how to make a wreath around the holidays, and you're just like hanging out in, I don't know, attaching leaves and flowers and whatever you want on this
Yeah.
hoop. So she came around and asked if we'd be willing to be interviewed, which I always think it's hard to ask people, you know, to be interviewed. So I said, sure, thinking, she'll just cut me. And then maybe about a week later, I start getting texts from my mother-in-law in Indiana, my vet, saying, I just heard you on NPR. You were at a wine and wreath making event. So yeah, I'm low key famous.
Okay. Okay. Well, I not to predict, but you never know what will happen with making waves. Maybe one day we'll be just as big as NPR, and people will be saying, "Hey, I heard you on Making Waves." That would be a cool step for us.
Oh my gosh, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get into a little bit more about you. So tell us about your role at Kleinschmidt and how you ended up working in the hydropower industry, just in general.
Sure. So I am a new senior regulatory advisor here at Kleinschmidt. I just started at the beginning of October, so I haven't been on the consulting side very long. I come from a long career, well, somewhat lengthy career in government. I worked at FERC for about 18 years and then moved over to the Department of Energy. And then, of course, now with Kleinschmidt. When I started my career, it was as an outdoor recreation planner. I truly wanted to be Leslie Note from Parks and Recreation. That's what I went to grad school for. I did a lot of work at my local Parks and Rec when I was in high school and college, and I just thought that's what I was going to do. And then I went to grad school, and one of the professors needed another person in his class, otherwise they were going to cut the class, and it was for outdoor recreation.
Oh, wow.
And that class led to me getting an interview with FERC because they needed an outdoor recreation planner for their hydro licensing division. And that was over 20 years ago. And
Wow.
I never looked back. Hydro got really interesting and I just kept trying different things and here I am.
That's really cool. I guess that's a great example for students out there that you never know what class you're going to end up taking that you think might be completely meaningless to your career, and that ends up actually defining your entire career path.
True, true. And if you can barter with a professor, we made a deal that if I took his class, he would come to happy hour every Wednesday. And
Okay.
so, it's like, I'll join your class. Then we'll go out for beers on Wednesdays. And pretty much he's the reason I have this career. So I guess I should send him a thank you card.
That's amazing. We'll have to send him this episode so he can listen to it and hear the shout out for.
Exactly.
What would you say is the part of your work that you enjoy the most?
Oh, definitely working with people, the collaboration. Sometimes it can get really interesting. Sometimes it can get a little spicy. Not everyone always agrees, but I like working with a lot of different stakeholders, different licensees. I've gotten to work with tribes, state fish and wildlife agencies, federal agencies. And just when I think like I've seen it all, then another project will come and it's like, I've never experienced these issues. I've never, met these people. It just, it never gets old. There's something always
Mm.
new.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting perspective because I think from the outside, people would look at the FERC licensing project and assume that it's very cookie cutter and it's kind of the same thing every time and it's the same people you're interacting with. But my experience is the same as yours. And I've obviously worked on regulatory projects fewer times than you have, but it's totally not the same. And every project is very, very different. And while there's some carryover skill and experience between the projects that helps you be more efficient and more effective, it is like almost learning a brand new skill every time you start a new project.
it's true. That's a good point, Ben. You learn something new on each project and it helps you probably with the next projects, but then those next projects you think, okay, I'm good, I got it, and something new comes that you build off of what you just learned. It's wild. I mean, even to people who have spent 30, 40, 50 years in hydro, they will tell you the same thing. It just never a dull day, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very cool. Well, that was a little bit about you, Shana, as a person. I do have some rapid fire questions now to dig a little bit deeper on some of your preferences, everyday preferences here. So I'm just going to run through these really quick. Would you rather work in a comfy office chair or would you rather have field boots on?
Ooh, that's hard. Probably my younger self would have said field boots, but not that I'm that old, but now I'm like, I like having the office and doing my work in a comfy office chair. And if I'm outside, it's not work related.
Yep. Yep. That makes sense. What about coffee before work starts or a cold beverage after?
I am coffee all the way. In fact,
Okay.
if I could only have one beverage outside of water for the rest of my life, coffee, hands down.
Okay.
Never take it away from me. I love it.
Iced coffee or hot coffee?
Depends on the time of day, but even if it is 100 degrees in DC, I want hot coffee in the morning.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. What about would you rather live without electricity or live without shoes?
Ooh, I think electricity. I think I could handle myself.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. Very, very cool. Yeah, that one always is interesting to hear
that's a
people's responses
stumper.
on. Yeah. And then last one here, cats or dogs?
Oh, well, I like both, but considering that we have our second dog, I am, I just have a weak spot for dogs. Dogs
Yeah.
all the way.
All right. I'm a dog person too, so we're on the same wavelength there. All right, let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about this project that you've worked on in the past. You and I had a little bit of a conversation about it before recording today, and I'm just super excited to dive into this and learn more about it and introduce the project and kind of some of the things you learned to the audience here. So, at a high level, if you could give us the big picture in about a minute, how would you describe what the Bear River Narrows project was?
Yeah, the Bear River Narrows project was an original unconstructed 10 megawatt hydro project. It was proposed by an irrigation company out in Idaho, and the intent of the project was to create water storage because, of course, they're an irrigation company.
Mm,
But why not add a little hydropower on top of that? So,
sure.
what they were proposing was an original unconstructed 113-foot earthen dam on the Bear River, just about 4.5-ish miles below one of PacifiCorp's existing hydropower projects. And
Okay.
again, the intent was to create water storage, but the thought was if we add hydropower on it, the project eventually pays for itself. This is going to create renewable energy. It's going to solve our water problems. It's just, you know, it's going to be the solution to all the things we don't have right now. And so you can imagine, if building a dam where there is none in today's
Hmm.
landscape, it was a pretty contentious project.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it studying something that's not there and not operating, that's really different from relicensings because you already have a picture of baseline facilities and operations, and here you're making a lot of guesses and assumptions and you have to conduct studies based on those.
Yeah.
So
Would you have been part of the project if there hadn't been a hydro component to it? My understanding is not, right? Because then FERC wouldn't have been involved.
yeah, well, that's so right. That's a great question, and it's a good note. So when I was on this project, I was the FERC project coordinator. I was on the FERC side, so I wasn't the consultant or the licensee. And
Hmm.
it's quite a bit different perspective being the regulator versus the consultant or the applicant. But that's exactly it. If you take the hydropower component off of it, FERC would not have jurisdiction over this. And so there was, I don't want to say a rumor, but the thought by the applicant slash developer was that by going through FERC to get this water storage project approved that had hydropower was an easier hill to climb than maybe like going to the core, I think would
Sure.
have been the authorizing entity. I'm not
Hmm.
really sure. It must have been the core if you take the hydropower off.
Yeah, it would be waters of the U.S. jurisdictional at that point. So that
Yes.
that makes sense. Really interesting, and that kind of that classic conundrum when it comes to new project work, right? You add hydro, and there's a lot of benefits of doing that in terms of the overall
Yes.
project and the impact of the community, but then it also widens the key stakeholders and partners that have to be part of the reviewing process. So, aside from FERC, who would you say were like the key partners or stakeholders that were kind of part of, chewing on, proposing, and arguing through
Oh,
this project?
wow. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, so it was a pretty deep bench in terms of stakeholders.
Sure.
But some of the big ones, of course, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. You had the State Fish and Wildlife Agency. You had the tribes. You had the State Historic Preservation Office involved. Of course, the local stakeholders. So this irrigation company had shareholders. So they were voting on every step in the process, whether to
Wow.
move forward or not. So that added
Hmm.
another layer of
Hmm.
complexity.
Hmm.
And then another big or key stakeholder in all of this was PacifiCorp, because
Sure.
what was being proposed in terms of project location, it was so close to the existing PacifiCorp project. There was at one point in the proposal the thought that this proposed location of the reservoir may overlap the existing PacifiCorp project boundary. And
Mm.
so in that, adding that layer, you have to get PacifiCorp's permission to do so. No project boundary for hydropower, at least the ones that FERC has jurisdiction over, they cannot overlap. So if you are proposing to, I don't know, to be adjacent or overlap an existing one, you have to get that existing licensee's permission to do so. It
Mm.
was name the issue, we had it all on this project.
Well, that transitions us really well to the next topic here, the next question I have for you. You've already touched on some of these, but if you could kind of boil it down, what would you say were some of the biggest challenges that you faced? Obviously, every licensing project has challenges, but what were the biggest ones that come to mind when thinking about this one?
Sure. So I think, right, just as you said, every licensing has its I don't even want to say typical, it has its challenges. Sometimes it's, depending on the resource, it might be the fish. Other ones, there might be a bigger cultural or tribal component. This was everything. All of the resources, it hadn't been it hadn't been touched. There was no disturbed land in where they were proposing this. So yeah, you had those typical challenges, but then on top of it, the irrigation canal company, they did have a consultant, but they were very green about the hydro process, about the collaboration with agencies,
Mm,
about what was required in terms of studies. We started off this project in consulting with them and their shareholders on what was required in terms of studies. And it shocked them that studies would have to be done before the project was approved. It
sure.
was it was a cost and time they had not accounted for. And
Mm,
so we were working with a very green applicant, and that made it even more challenging because
hmm.
even an experienced developer, this is still a very challenging project.
Yeah.
And then just to add more layers on that, you had the community divided in that here's an area that had several drought years and it did not look like there was an end in sight. How are they going to get water for irrigation purposes? That was a real issue, and I really felt for them. So you had half of them that thought this is going to be the miracle we need to get water back to our crops and back to our land. And then there was another half that said you can't ever undo a dam or a big construction project. We don't want this landscape changing. It's not worth it. So there was a lot of emotion involved with this project. And that made it really hard because you had to separate some of those discussions on studies or moving forward in the process. You had to keep the emotion separate from what was required in the licensing process.
Yeah. And I think that kind of dichotomy that you just pointed out between two oppositional sides having an argument in so many things in the real world, there's typically maybe one side that's a little bit more intellectually honest and truthful, and the other side maybe not so much. But I feel like hydro so often falls within this situation where both parties are kind of right, where there's a
Yeah.
true community need for energy or for water storage or for other things. And yet, as we all know, dams are a pretty drastic change in certain locations and they can change landscapes and other things. And so it is kind of this balance of between the two and trying to find that balance. And that's what I personally, deviating from this project discussion for just a second, love about hydro so much is the challenge of finding that balance between the two, recognizing that both sides of that argument are often both correct, which makes the arguments even more heated. But there's usually or oftentimes a solution that is acceptable to both. And finding that compromise and finding compromise in general is something that we need a lot more of in this country. So hydro is a good kind of example for that being practiced out in real life.
Yeah,
Um,
Ben, that is a great way to capture exactly what this situation was. It's just, yeah, you see the benefits and the risks to both sides. And so it trying to stay on top of what is required and needed to get through the process in order to help the regulator FERC make that decision without being too tied up in how you personally feel about it, which is hard. We
yeah.
all have our own feelings, but no, that was a great snapshot.
One more follow up, just in terms of challenges. Given that you were on the FERC side for this project, you've been on the consulting side as well. Do you feel like it's more challenging to work with consultants as somebody who works for FERC, or to work with FERC as a consultant?
Ooh, that's a good question. So when I was at FERC, I actually loved seeing consultants because often, even if the applicant is a hydro owner, they aren't going through relicensings every day or every year. It's a tough process. And unless you're doing it day in, day out all the time, it's really hard to follow and it can get stressful. And I felt like the consultants had a good handle on the process and guiding them through. I always had good experiences with that. And then of course on the FERC side, I would say, oh, when I'm a consultant, you know, I'd be able to say this bluntly to the applicant because sometimes the applicants, and not to the consultant's failure for trying to show them, but sometimes they don't see the writing on the wall. And on the
Sure.
FERC side, we are not allowed to be that blunt. We
Mm,
have to keep it neutral because we're the decision maker.
hmm.
Now, being on this side, it's not so easy to do that either, to just be direct or blunt, because it's not our job to make the decision for our clients, right? It is to lay out the options and the risks and weigh in on where we see people bringing up some challenges and what this could mean down the road. In this case, there's a big risk that FERC might say no. I wasn't the consultant, so I don't know when or how that conversation was had, but you can only do so much as a consultant in that the end of the day, it is in the applicant's hands what they decide to do.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's hard.
No doubt, no doubt. Well, that sounds like a real team effort to work through that. Let's talk a little bit about the people that were behind this. So, from your perspective, and as you mentioned, there's tons of stakeholders, tons of people involved in this, but what made this project, I guess, special from a people perspective? We already talked about some of the challenges of having that many people involved, but what was cool about that?
So I was relatively young at FERC when I took on this project. I was stormed into my boss's office and I'm like, when are you going to put me on a project? And, you said the only way I'm going to learn is if you throw me in. And so I really made my case, not knowing what I was getting myself into. Looking back, I'm like, that's crazy. Should have never put someone that young on this project. But what came out of it, my team, who I had a senior biologist, archaeologist, a fisheries biologist, like they all really helped me and supported me to do a great job. They gave me confidence. They gave me enough room to really find my way, but they were there as a safety net if I really screwed something up. And I think I got a little street cred with them in that they're like, whoa, we just had 300 people really have some strong thoughts and feelings for the past 12 hours in a small room. And Shana handled herself. So that was really cool because I got really close with my team and we developed a really good working relationship and trust. On the outside, there was a woman who worked for Idaho Fish and Game. Her name was Cindy Robertson, and she was the manager of the biologist group who were working on this project. Again, there was a lot of emotion because people are local, but Cindy reminded everyone, including us, that our job as agencies is to assess what is being proposed, to figure out if there are going to be adverse effects or effects, and if we can mitigate them or not, and go from there. It is not our job to say, yes, there should be hydro or no, there shouldn't. We have to look at the whole package and try not to be emotional about it. And I just remember thinking, Cindy is so badass.
Mm,
She never got mad. She always stayed neutral. She was always thoughtful and really did a great job of bringing the temperature back down so we could keep moving forward with the process and let it play out as FERC requires in the licensing process. So I picked up some things from people I worked with, like I would like to model that. I really aspire to have some of those qualities as I grow into my career because it just was so remarkable. And of course, she's a lady, and I'm like, it's a lot of men in hydro. And
hmm
I just thought, man, she is so smart. I want to be like Cindy.
Yeah, yeah. It's amazing how I feel like in the hydro world, whether it's on the engineering, relicensing, or science side of things, oftentimes the people that I find myself admiring the most are not the ones that, make the strongest argument or, convert people to their side of the argument based off of, providing a really good argument and providing evidence. It's often the people that are just really calm, cool, and collected, composed, and kind of how that rubs off on the rest of the team. And so it's a different type of individual that I feel like really succeeds in hydro and in relicensing in that way. It's not like being a lawyer, right? Where maybe you're rewarding people for being the best at arguing, but instead being the best at kind of finding that olive branch, bringing the temperature down, and ultimately, hopefully, finding the right answer. So,
No, you're exactly right. And just to add, it's the listening component.
yeah,
Sometimes we're already gearing up for our defense or what we want to say or questions before someone's even done speaking how they feel or how they're seeing this picture. And I think, Cindy always was pointing out to me, because I talked to her quite a bit, that really listening to people, really listening and digesting, and then thinking about, what your thoughts are. I still aspire to that because it's hard to do, but it is, man, it is a quality that some people have.
yeah. Well, shouts to you, Cindy, if you're listening to this episode. Sounds like you had a very, very cool role on this project. Let's move on to lessons and advice. What would you say were some lessons that this project taught you, and maybe lessons that others in the industry could learn from this project at a high level?
Sure. So, oh gosh, I think going back to Cindy, in the really listening to all the viewpoints, all of all the whole proposal, digging into what people are relaying in terms of, study data and reports and just possible issues that might come up. I think the listening component is huge. I would also say preparation. Some of these meetings, not that we weren't prepared, but I don't think, for instance, the scoping meeting, we started the day agency meeting at noon. And by the time the evening meeting was supposed to start, I think it was an hour before, we had not finished the agency meeting. We had to close the agency meeting down to have an hour to transition into the night meeting, which went past midnight until they finally kicked us out of the building. I think looking back, maybe preparing for some scenarios like that would have helped in hindsight, just us feeling more prepared.
Sure.
But then again, sometimes you just never know how things are going to turn out.
hmm
I also think, again, I wasn't the consultant, but looking back and being a consultant now, sometimes I think about if I was the consultant to this applicant, how would I have managed this? I felt like at times the applicant really did not have a good read on the room in terms of what the agencies were saying and for studies, for risks of the project, for adverse effects that if this proposed project goes through, what may occur. I think they just thought no one's going to say no to energy. No one's going to say no to a new energy project. It's going to be a yes. It's just how expensive will it be?
Mm,
And I think when FERC came out with their environmental impact statement, they were a little shocked at FERC's final analysis of the project. And so, again, I don't know what happened, but I think about that in terms of all you can do is prepare your client or the applicant for the possibilities.
mhm.
And that takes a lot of preparation. And it's a hard job because sometimes it's not good news, but I think that's worth its weight in gold to be direct and let them know. Part of our job is sometimes to deliver not so great news,
Mhm.
but I think they'll respect us more for it in the end.
Yeah, or even telling our clients what they might not want to hear even before a project starts, right? Like it's
Yes.
really difficult to have a client come to you and want you to do some work where they're going to pay you for it and for you to talk them out of doing that. But that's really where a lot of quality long-term relationships are made with clients is when you're willing to be the person to steer them out of doing some additional work because of your experience and knowing what the likely outcome is going to be. Ultimately leaving the decision up to them, but being honest with them about what you see is coming down the pipe. And that obviously makes delivering that hard news a little bit easier when you were upfront with them about what it might be the first time around. So,
Yeah. No, I completely agree.
cool. Well, another question here for you, just in terms of looking forward now, taking this experience and having it in the back of your pocket, amongst many other experiences within the regulatory world. Why would you say a client should consider hiring Kleinschmidt to work on a project like this? What do you think kind of value we would bring for that type of a project?
I think Kleinschmidt does a really good job of weighing out all the options and scenarios and risks from the start of the project because Kleinschmidt isn't looking at a project like, I hope this goes as long as it can so we have a big contract and whatever the outcome, who cares because we're getting paid. I think Kleinschmidt really cares about helping applicants and clients figure out the best solution for them. And sometimes that means, in this project, yes, they went forward, but there's a world, a universe where maybe a consultant for this project in early discussions might have swayed the irrigation company to not do this type of project and go a different route because this project went on for 10 plus years. It was a lot of money and a lot of time. And probably if you look up Bear River Narrows today, that project does not exist. That's the really hard part of it. I think Kleinschmidt has a lot of expertise in licensing and collaborating with other agencies and good relationships. And one of the big things is building trust with the client. And again, it goes back to sometimes telling the client some hard news. Like there are a lot of risks with this type of project. It is possible it may be a no, and weighing those because really we're here for the client. We're not here to make money. We're here for the client. So,
Yeah, very well said. That was really cool. Thank you again, Shana, for sharing the story here behind the Bear River Narrows project and the work that you did at that time and the work that you continue to do here at Kleinschmidt. I know we're ecstatic to have you on the licensing team amongst a group of a bunch of really awesome licensing folks that I've had a chance to work with, and I'm excited to work with you on a project, maybe something like this down the road. Any closing remarks before we sign off for the day?
No, I mean, I think when I think about Bear River Narrows, it really, you learn so much with these projects along the way, and this one really built my confidence up. I will say real quick, there's one moment in those scoping meetings where we had to time the speakers because we had so many lined up to speak. So we had our archaeologist be the timekeeper, and he told people, you get 2 minutes. At 1 minute, I'm going to stand up. When you have 30 seconds, we're going shoulder to shoulder. So they would know when their time was about to end. Well, toward the end of the meeting, because it's almost midnight, there was one speaker that went on, and our archaeologist ended up bear hugging the speaker, which everyone started laughing. And the speaker was, you could tell he was easygoing, he wasn't offended. It was a light moment in a really hard meeting and gave some levity to it. Like, okay, we're all human, but that's one of the memories that sticks out with me is this funny little project and I don't know, the hills and turns along the way.
Yeah, well, that's a great story. I will say it's always a little bit dangerous to have an archaeologist keep time given the scale and time at which they deal with things. Usually they don't deal with scales in minutes. So it sounds like he was operating maybe a little bit outside of his area of expertise doing that.
Yeah, well, yeah, we gave him a stopwatch, and yeah, Frank was the comedic relief, which, in that type of meeting, it was needed. So,
Yeah, good, good. Well, this has been awesome, Shayna. Again, appreciate your time. Excited for folks to learn a little bit more about you and a little bit more about this project. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in to Making Waves. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share with a colleague, a client, or a friend. Join us next time as we continue to highlight the projects and the people that make Kleinschmidt so special. Thanks, everybody.